From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. This program is a very unique one about the Montana Constitution, and as we've said many times during our series, when you think of the period of progressive change in Montana, the Constitution and the development of our Constitution and its adoption stand out as a beacon of progressive thought and progressive action, the passage of that Constitution. Today we're going to look at it, and we're going to look at two particular things in the Constitution. First, we're going to spend some time later in the show on the environmental aspects of the Constitution, the environmental protections that are embodied in the new Constitution. But before we get at that, we're going to get at the preamble of the Constitution. And interestingly enough, our guests today are the two principal authors of the wonderful preamble of the Montana Constitution. So we are joined today by Bob Campbell. Bob was a delegate from Missoula at the Constitutional Convention, originally from Sidney, Montana, passed through Red Lodge for a few years, right. Ended up at the University of Montana where he got a degree in pharmacy, and then went back to Law School and had a degree in law. Right. And in 1967, after becoming an attorney, he stayed in practice as a lawyer for all the time up until today, but he ran for a delegate to the Constitutional Convention and was successful and was on the Bill of Rights Committee of the Constitutional Convention. He, as an attorney, by the way, you spent 22 years with the Labor Department, being the principal attorney for the Labor Department in Helena, but probably nobody more epitomizes the term citizen activist than Bob Campbell. You've been an activist politically and governmentally all these years and remain so.
Thank you.
So thank you for joining us. And also joining us is Maynann Ellingson. She was Maynann Robinson at the time of the convention. Maynann was the youngest delegate at the Constitutional Convention. We've known each other since graduates. I was in graduate school and you were just finishing your undergraduate work. But after being in graduate school, one of your mentors, Ellis Waldron, mentor for many of us, persuaded you that you should run for the Constitutional Convention, and you did. And lo and behold, at I think the age of 24, you were able to be elected to the Constitutional Convention. And interestingly enough, you were not an attorney at the time, but being in the convention was the major stimulus for you to go to law school and become an attorney. You graduated in 1976 from the University of Montana Law School, and after 6 years with the city attorney's office, you went with the Dorsey Whitney Law Firm, where you stayed until actually, what is it?
About
29 years until 2012. And Maynann was probably the most preeminent public finance attorney in the state of Montana. Many years as state bond counsel. So we had opportunity to work together for many years on public finance issues. But you know, it's a pleasure to have both of you here because of this preamble particularly. Most of us are struck when we look at this wonderful Constitution and we're able to read this opening, and I'm just going to take the liberty of reading your words, predominantly your words, because they're so wonderful. The preamble leading into the Constitution says, "We, the people of Montana, grateful to God for the quiet beauty of our state, the grandeur of our mountains, the vastness of our rolling plains, and desiring to improve the quality of life, equality of opportunity, and to secure the blessings of liberty for this and future generations, to ordain and establish this Constitution." I mean, wow, those are just stunningly beautiful and meaningful words. Every time I read them, it stops me. And I want to start off by, before we get into the process of how did we come up with these words, maybe, Mainan, your reflections on it, because it seems to speak to Montana, not to the law. What's your take on the basic nature of our preamble as, say, compared to others?
Well, it's different in that it does recognize the importance of the physical environment of Montana, from which many of us really felt like we took on this mission. We were inspired, I think, by the beauty of our state, and I think as we get into the rest of our discussion today about our impetus for natural resources and the environment, it was a compelling time for us to want to protect our environment. And I think that whole notion of protecting the environment gets reflected not only in that article, but presupposing it as part of why we were writing this Constitution and the strong grounding that everybody had in the beauty of our state. So I think that is what makes our preamble so unique, is that it goes on to state the principles for which we are doing this Constitution, improving the quality of life and equality of opportunity, but a strong recognition of the place, Montana the place.
Now, if you think of Montana, we call it the last best place a lot of times, besides a lot of other nicknames, but the reality is the people of Montana are very tied to the land. The uniqueness of the land, the resources have been an economic boon to the state for many, many years. But when we think of a quality of life, it's related to this grandeur of Montana you spoke of. Right. I think it resonates with every Montanan. Whether you're a native of Montana or whether you're a newcomer, it speaks to the uniqueness of Montana. It's about this huge, huge piece of property, fourth largest state, 144,000 square miles of just unique land, and the recognition of that is, I'm recognizing a little bit of the essential nature of Montana and Montanans, seems to me. I don't know what led you to that, although you were telling me you did have some inspirations for your starting words.
Right. We all watched as the legislature finally voted 2/3 to put the question to the people, do you want a constitutional convention? The reason that they voted to have it is because they took a study from the Legislative Council in 1969, and they found out that 52% of the old Constitution was absolutely obsolete and should be replaced. So they did a study, they passed it by 2/3, the people agreed, League of Women Voters was very influential, and they set it up so delegates could get elected. When they did that, some legislators tried to file, and they were told by the Supreme Court that all elected public officials were ineligible to run to write the Constitution. So Mainan and I didn't know her then, but we were in the primary there in September of 1971. We ran, we made it through the primary.
You were both running in Missoula.
Right, and we had 8 because it was based on the legislature's
reapportionment,
finding. Well, it was 8 at large. It wasn't single member districts. So she and I were running, and she got, I think, the most votes out of the 8. I had number 7, and so then we came to Helena. But as I was going door to door for this, I was thinking, I'd really like to get on the Bill of Rights Committee, and I'd like to write the preamble. And I said, if I was writing the preamble, I'd want to describe it first as we have the beauty of our state, the nature, to geographically, just describe what we have, and then put the political reasons as why it needs a constitution to protect those values. Now, we didn't know at the time, but later, a Supreme Court of Montana decision said those words are enacted to be part of the law. Yeah, they're in there for a reason, and they should be relied on. When people say it, they look at it, and then it has an effect.
Did you find any inspiration in that gigantic painting behind the speakers, behind the podium?
In fact, that was one of the four things that Maynan and I, on January the 27th, they had a meeting over at the Historical Society. But anyway, we took the Indians' issues, and we had a Historical Society party that night, January 27th, 1972. So we went to that, and I told her that we wanted to take the Indians' influence, the Charlie Russell influence. We wanted to get the book Travels with Charlie, how he describes Montana.
That was a different Charlie, right? That wasn't Charlie Russell.
No, that was the dog of
Charlie,
John Steinbeck.
The poodle of John Steinbeck,
yes,
right?
And he loved Butte, Montana for some reason. He thought it was a unique
place. That's not hard to understand.
And he said if he had his seacoast, he would move here immediately. But he did say that it was the richness of our rolling grasslands that he praised eastern Montana, which some people didn't see it that way. So we used that. We after this meeting we had at the Historical Society, I asked Maynan if we could write it. She lived with Dr. Moore. So after the Historical Society meeting, we used the Indian influence, the Charlie Russell paintings, John Steinbeck's, and we just wanted to put this all into one preamble.
When you go to put the words together,
right.
I mean, it is a creative act.
Right, we're sitting there.
It's got to come out of you. These words had to have meanings more than just they reflected somebody else's thoughts. These were coming out of both of you about, I mean, you can see the love of Montana inherent in the words. And you, how long did you work that night?
I was thinking of, 6 months on that.
No, how long did you work that night?
That night, we probably got there about 2 hours maybe.
Yeah.
2.5. So we went to the Historical Society, we got the materials, and we sat on the couch and we started from the beginning. We, the people of Montana. And then we said, instead of the old Constitution preamble that says recognizing Almighty God, we would recognize the Native Americans by saying, instilled with the spirit of our Creator, gathering our strength from the grandeur of our mountains and the richness of our rolling grasslands, with a reverence for the quiet beauty of our state, with the desire to live in peace in order to improve the quality of life and equality of opportunity for this and succeeding generations, do hereby ordain, establish this Constitution. We put it in the next morning, and it was a delegate proposal 59 and went to the Bill of Rights Committee, and we were so proud of it that we were sure that was going to be adopted.
Every word.
Every word.
Every word.
We thought it was perfect. It was perfect. Nobody could improve upon that.
You know, it is really true about the creative act of writing that, you know, when I took freshman writing at Montana State University, then Montana State College many years ago, I remember my instructor saying to me, editing your own work is like murdering your baby. Right. You know, but you have to leave it up to somebody else to do the editing because we love our own words. But those were marvelous words, but there was some change that occurred in them. But let me ask the question, did other people submit alternative visions of these words?
There was 4 other proposed Bill of Rights preambles that was sent to our committee, the Bill of Rights Committee, and we considered those, and we had a public hearing, but we liked ours the best, and we had the best response to it, and we didn't want to change a word of it.
Now, the committee didn't want to change a word of it, but in fact, did they inside the committee?
Well, the first thing we have is a public hearing on this, and we thought everybody would just be ecstatic over the whole thing, but we had 4 witnesses that said, you have removed God from the preamble of the Montana Constitution.
And God was there before,
If you don't put him in there, he will punish the state of Montana. And it is in the 1889 Constitution. So I could tell.
Now, you had the Creator, and you
Right.
played off of that from a Native American perspective,
and we
right?
explained that to the people that were against it.
But
They said, no, God will still punish you. One of our members on the Bill of Rights Committee, George James, says, well, God isn't in the U.S. preamble and Constitution either. Do you think he's punished the United States for overlooking that too? And I said, well, yeah. But anyway, it was clear I had to take that out. If we
so
wanted to get a Constitution,
caution being the note that you don't want to have a big battle over something like
well,
that. You
if there's
change
one thing in
Creator
the
to God?
Constitution the people don't like, they're going to vote against the whole document. So we had to get everything out that someone could use to kill the Constitution on one single item.
Well, particularly emotional issues like that.
Because this was a Constitution that had to go to the voters on June 6th. But
so what happened to Creator?
well, I just took it out right then. I knew we were dead if I left it in, so it would fail. So I took it out and put in, as it is now, grateful to God.
In the committee.
In the committee.
Inside
Yeah.
in the committee.
Yeah, and I had another delegate tell me
Now it
that.
looks like did they add secure the blessings of liberty in that? Was that added, or was that in your original?
They put that out. We had style and drafting committee. We
yeah.
had to put everything through there. So some of this they looked and they made some changes, but the major ones held up until just at the end, and then we were the night before it had to go into effect. And Chet Blaylock on our committee was vice chairman.
Well, now I was going to ask you about that, because if any delegate would to bring forth language, that's fine. But if you're on the committee, you have a little more stroke.
Right.
And yet, there was alternative language suggested by Don Foster.
Yes, he was a committee member, and we were at loggerheads over this the night before it had to go to the floor. But Wade Hood was our committee chairman, a very strong committee chairman, and whatever we came up with, he would get through. We were sure. We were the strongest committee. Everything we wanted, we got through. And the preamble then was the work we did that night with Chet Blaylock, the school teacher from Laurel, great person, and with that,
what did Chet do?
We lost the rolling grasslands, and that vastness came in, and we didn't like the vastness.
So you got a little bit of a change to vastness of rolling plains instead of rolling grasslands.
Right.
But that was what? Was Chet brokering a deal between you and?
He was the vice chairman, and our committee chairman Wade Hood was so upset with us the way we argued.
You guys were fighting.
One word. We were really fighting, and the next day we were going to put it to the floor. So he says, Chet, you come back with these two at 8 o'clock tonight in the committee room, and you work it out. And I want to see at 8 in the morning the final preamble, and we're putting it into the floor, and that's it.
With everyone supporting it in the committee.
Yeah. So they did, and Chet, held us both ways, and this is a compromise that was made. And so I think it's good. There isn't enough in there to say that it's not a great constitution.
Oh well, it's
but
it's stunning language.
Okay, it gets their attention.
So, I mean, I want to compliment both of you. I'm not throwing sugar at you.
No.
This is really remarkable wordsmithing.
The New York Times and Time Magazine both picked it up and gave it great credit during this session. Yeah. So it was well received. And it still does. It does. It brings tears to your eyes.
And do you remember how it went on when it came to the floor? Was it a small issue then at that point?
Yes. I mean, people.
Because you had the whole Bill of Rights to do.
We did, yes. But the committee had done such a good job under Wade's hands. Really, the only other delegate proposals were there were 3. From within the committee itself. Don Foster had 2, and George Rollins had 1, and then Jack Ward had 1, who wasn't on the committee. But I think the committee did such a good job of compromising and working out language from the people who felt strongly about it, that when it came out with a ton of support.
Right. Yeah. And so it was adopted as part of the Bill of Rights plank, so to speak.
Yeah.
We had a public hearing, then we had our floor. So people could suggest amendments, but Wade Hood was such a strong chairman that We got exactly what we wanted. He was the most powerful committee chairman, I think, at the convention. He still is.
Our viewers are going to have the opportunity to hear about the Bill of Rights from Wade and Rick Applegate in another program.
Oh,
So
both of them outstanding.
The big picture aspects and other things on the Bill of Rights, they're covering in great detail. But this we reserve for you, the primary authors, to discuss.
Well, we're proud
because
to do
you really should be proud of what you've written. It stands the test of times, let me tell you. Now, there's a bit of a spin-off in this thing, because clearly, as you said, Mainan, it kind of reflects the sense of place and the sense of value that lends itself to the question of, well, how do we deal with this value? How do we deal with it in terms of what, if the term environment is right? You know, that's a hot button word for some people, but in reality, it was an openly used term at that time without any animus. I mean, it was like, hey, we have environmental issues. They were happening. The first Earth Day was 2 years before that. There was a higher degree of consciousness of environmental issues all across the nation. It was not an issue that divided people by party at the time. Some of the best environmental legislation of the 70s were sponsored by Republicans in the Montana legislature. So there were divisions and differences on the issue, but in that Bill of Rights that came out was the first recognition of the environment. And that was in Section 3 of Article 2, Declaration of Rights, and inalienable rights. Now, when you think of inalienable rights, you start thinking about the federal, the life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, concepts like that. And in the middle of it, we have language that says those rights include the right to a clean and healthful environment.
Well, that came in after we first considered what to put in for environmental rights in our Article 9, the environment and natural resources.
But let's stay with this.
But
let's stay with this.
You want to stay with the preamble?
Let's stay with what's in the Bill of Rights. Well, you're saying that term was used elsewhere in the Constitution, but it wasn't in here.
No, it hadn't been in there when we passed it, and it wouldn't be in there if we didn't put it in the environment and natural resources section first. We would never have gotten it into the inalienable rights unless we already had stated.
So it was in the other one. But
we voted it in, and Mainan is very active on that.
We're going to talk about that.
But that's what happened afterwards.
In this one,
that's the last thing that happened that was put in.
When it came out of committee, was the right to a clean and healthful environment in the inalienable rights section?
No, it was not.
Okay.
It was not.
So let's talk about how that got in there, because that's pretty important. It's in the Declaration of Rights of the Constitution.
Right. But it had to reflect what we already did in the Environment and Natural Resource Committee, and Mainan can tell you about that. The biggest issue at the convention was what to do about the environment.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. But let's see if we can wrap up this thing right here. I know we're not following the sequence, but we're looking at this thing. We have this as an inalienable right. Was there an argument about adding this when it came up?
It would have never gotten
actually, we voted on the environmental article on May 1st.
Okay.
And we had a very long and tedious day because when the environmental article came out of its committee, which was a Natural Resources and Environment Committee, it was a very watered down version of what we currently have. We spent an entire day, many hours, of trying to get the delegates to approve the insertion of the words clean and healthful in front of the environment. The way that came out of committee was that we were basically going to have and preserve an environment for this and future generations. And really, I can't tell you the number of votes, I can tell you, we're over 8 votes, that occurred on that day in attempts to get some kind of modifiers in front of environment. And I think it's really important to understand why that was so important, because, you know, we were from Missoula, where on any given day you couldn't even see the mountains because of what was coming out of Horner Waldorf. It was the beginning of strip mining in eastern Montana. We had the aluminum plant up in Columbia Falls spewing out
killing all those trees,
all kinds of yes, and then we had clear cutting. We still had waters that were polluted from the mining at the turn of the century. So for a great number of us, it's like we didn't want that exact environment that we had in
You didn't
Montana.
want the status quo.
We
No.
didn't want the
No.
status
And that's
quo.
true.
And so, you know, I give so much credit to Bob on this natural resources article, because we all made many attempts, and it was really his final proposal to insert the word clean and healthful in front of the environment that prevailed. And I think it's worth having Bob talk a little bit about our efforts
Before
that
we
day.
talk about the process, let me take just a
Okay.
second. Does anybody, and I didn't ask you this before, so this is an open question, who coined clean and healthful as the adjectives, as the modifying words? Do you have any recall? of that?
Yes, I do. It was certainly in one of my earlier amendments, but it wasn't as though we were pulling those terms out of thin air, which some of the lawyers opposing us were arguing. They were saying, how can we add these words? We don't know what they mean. We're going to have all kinds of lawsuits trying to establish what they mean. But those were words that were actually in federal legislation. They were in some of the environmental protection legislation, and so courts had already started working on and carving out what those terms meant. So it wasn't like, you know, we were inventing out of whole cloth these two totally foreign concepts.
Now, when the committee produced a report, and it was a rather neutral reference to the environment, not with the modifiers, clean and healthful,
Right.
just we should maintain an environment, or the chairman of the committee, who we recently lost,
Yes.
Louise Cross from Glendive, I believe spoke rather strongly on the floor when it was introduced about whether she thought it was strong enough or not, didn't she? I mean, she was, Louise, I don't know which, either one of you want to take that as to the role Louise played in this thing.
All right, that's pivotal. Louise Cross has to be given the credit for being the best, strongest environmental delegate of the convention. And that's why Leo Grable appointed her to be chairman of the Environment and Natural Resources. But on the committee, she only had one other person that would agree with her that we should have strong environmental wording to back up. And the rest of the committee overwhelmingly opposed any adjectives above clean and healthful. They just wanted to say we had an environment, and they said, let's let the legislature decide what kind of standards we have in Montana for the environment. You're just going to create problems where they have lawsuits, and out-of-state experts will come in and say that clean means you could dump your oil into the creek, and if that expert testifies, then this clean and healthful is hurt the environment. So with Louise, on the day that this article was submitted to the floor, she didn't even have enough people to do a minority report. You had to get 3 delegates to do a minority. So she, as chairman, had to stand up there, and she wrote the night before a statement of what the majority of that committee had decided to do with no protection for the environment was wrong. And it took her to tears, but the second in the committee was C.B. McNeil, and he took the proposal that the delegates had in that committee, and then he brought it to the floor, and he brought it up as it would have been without clean and healthful environment. So then, now that was the biggest issue of the convention. We had the rafters were full. The build-up to this was amazing because what was the state going to do about the environment? A lot of business communities, money, that was the most controversial step. And there, if you want to kill a constitution, you put something in there that's going to get people mad. So I think with Maine Ann now, the day that Louise sits down and C.B. McNeil gets up and says, let's just have it the way it is. And then Maine Ann, I think this is a good spot for you to say what happened on the floor after that.
Well, the committee report, and C.B. McNeil, who ended up carrying the committee report because the chair, it really wasn't her committee report, and she didn't feel it was as strong as it could have been, and she stated that on the floor. So it was very hard for her to say this is the strongest environmental article in any U.S. Constitution, which CB and the committee claimed. There were a great many of us who did not believe it was the strongest because we did have at our disposal several other state constitutions that had recently dealt with the environment. Puerto Rico and Illinois and actually even North Dakota all had adopted environmental provisions in their constitution to some extent. But there were really two big issues. The first of which was this issue of, I'll just read you what the committee report said. It came out, the proposal was protection and enhancement. The state of Montana and each person must maintain and enhance the environment of the state for present and future generations. So the language there brought about this whole question of what modifiers should there be, if any, in terms of the environment. C.B. McNeil and the committee felt, and I think they were supported by other lawyers, Marshall Murray in particular, that it was a stronger constitution by not having any modifiers in front of the environment. So that formed one big item of debate. The minority report that Louise tried to get out would have added an additional provision to this article that would have provided a Montana resident with the right to legal proceedings against a governmental agency charged with enforcing that article. And during that period of time, there were a lot of cases going before the U.S., well, not a lot, but there was one major case going before the Supreme Court. Who had the right to sue on behalf of the environment, or did anybody have a right to sue? And certainly in Montana at the time, we only recognized standing, meaning a right for anybody to go to court, if they personally suffered some damages. So many of us felt like, well, my gosh, if there has to be damage to the environment and it has to be personal to someone, how do we really protect the environment? So some kind of remedy or right to redress the environment or to protect the environment before damage occurred was critical, and that was what was critical to Louise. And so we had to set about those two issues sort of separately. And as I said, the biggest and longest fight was on getting the right to a clean and healthful environment in the Constitution.
Did the standing issue get resolved favorably, or was that left for adjudication later or something?
It got resolved in a way that I think ended up being satisfactory to most people, in that the provision that was finally adopted basically provided that the legislature had to establish remedies. So it had to provide access and standing to enable people to go to court to enforce the environmental protections. And then the other thing, and this will get back to your point a little bit earlier about once we got the right to a clean and healthful environment in the article, and then 6 days later, on March the 7th, when Bill Burkhart got it put into the inalienable rights section, once it got into that section, it became a fundamental constitutional right that had a much higher level of scrutiny than if it just had remained in Article 9 itself. So it became more, I would say, self-executing once it got put into the Bill of Rights.
But it was put, those words, clean and healthful, ended up in the, what is it, section, Article 9.
Yes.
Environment and Natural Resources. You said there were 8 votes? Let's kind of drive through that a little bit before we get to the final vote that worked. Obviously, there were 7 votes that failed.
Okay, I'll start a little bit on that.
Yeah.
Okay, so when they submitted that on the floor, one of our Bill of Rights members, George James from Libby, he just rose and said, I move that we add clean and healthful before the word environment.
Seems appropriate coming from a delegate from Libby now that we've had a little history.
He's wonderful.
Pass.
I loved him. He was great. So anyway, they promptly voted him down. So this really infuriated Jerry Cate, who sat next to me, because he
from Billings
and others wanted a public trust. Now, when they came to me early in the session, say, will you support us in getting a public trust in the Montana Constitution? I said, no, I won't, because 1, you'll never get this body to adopt a public trust, and 2, if you did get it in, it would kill the Constitution. So I'm not interested in talking about a public trust. So I just went aside. It wasn't my committee, and I didn't do anything until the afternoon that we were going to decide what to do. But Maynann and Louise Cross and others, we listened to Jerry Cate, and Jerry Cate got up and he wanted the public trust. That's it. And he gave probably
pretty good orator.
He was great.
Oh yeah.
And then the whole all of the galleries were applauding him after that speech. It was wonderful. So Leo had to bring him down again, and they did. But he was great. But okay, they defeated that. Okay, that was
so
number
he
2.
actually offered a
He'd offered it. We
specific
discussed
proposal.
it. The state would own the water and the air, and it would keep it clean.
Not that they would own it,
but they'd have
they
a
would
right.
hold it in trust.
Right.
And that's the way the environment is dealt with in a lot of European countries. It's held in trust. And so it wasn't that they owned it, but once you started talking about holding it in trust,
trust,
people did start talking about we were taking private land, and that was the
would you
kiss
be
of
able
death.
to?
That was the
That's a
kiss of death.
bugaboo right there, yeah.
Okay, so that was voted down. Then Arlene Reichert stood up, and then she used...
Who has appeared on one of our programs.
Okay, Great Falls, and she sat right next to me. And we seated alphabetically, which was the best thing that happened. Dale Harris, our executive director, did that in our first meeting, put us all alphabetically. He was great. You should have an hour on him alone, but he was the key to the whole thing. But anyway, on the public trust thing, we go through Cate, and then here's Arlene Reichert. She stands up and quotes part of the Illinois proposed Constitution, and that goes down. But it gets a little closer, okay? So we're all there. This is really high-powered. The press, everybody is really watching us on this. And so then
it's a battle royale.
It came to Maynann. So we'll let you talk about when you came up with your proposal after Arlene's was denied.
Yeah, and I think maybe there was 1 or 2 in between. I had some additional amendments that did a couple of things. One, it again inserted clean and healthful, and then it had some stronger language about citizens being able to directly bring a lawsuit to enforce the environmental provisions without waiting for the legislature to enact remedies. So I had a lot of good support, people rising in support of that and saying that we were getting close and this was getting better and better. But even the final vote, that went down 50 to 54 or something like that. I got 50 A votes and 54 no votes. So then you come in next, right, Bob?
Well, it was about 5 o'clock, and we'd had this argued so many times. And there I was sitting there, and I campaigned, and I liked clean and healthful environment. And here I am on the Bill of Rights Committee. I didn't have anything on that committee. So I just said, boy, you know, it's 10 after 5. People are going home. They've been defeated. I can't let it go. So I stand up and I said, Mr. President, I move that we add clean and healthful before the word environment in this provision. And so President Leo Grable says, fine, okay, Mr. Campbell, you can speak. And as soon as I started to speak, C.B. McNeil stands up and says, I call for the question. The question means there's no debate,
Once
there's
you
no
do that,
speech.
you got to take a vote.
We got to take a vote.
Well, you know, usually they're saying, "I'm ready to get out of here.
He
Let's
didn't
stop
argue a
talking and
thing.
start voting."
Yeah,
right?
so he just went right to the point. Well, just do it. You lost all these times in a row. Let's see what you do this time. So he said, oh, and so I sat down, and they took the vote. 61 against me on that, okay?
So it
That
was
would be
worse.
kind of a
It was the
butt-kicking.
worst. It was the worst
It
of all
was
of
the
them.
worst of
And
all
I
of
said,
them, and we thought with
Making
every
progress.
vote we were getting closer.
You're getting
And
progress,
I'm
but
sitting
I
there.
think they wanted to go home.
Oh, they did want to go home. They were. They won all these times. We had lobbyists that were leaving. Some delegates were leaving, and they were talking on the floor.
Maybe lobbyists leaving was helpful.
Well, I don't know, but they, about 5:15, they were ready to go home. So they were. They're starting to go home. So I was sitting there just dazed, and here I got a note from the page, and it was from Leo Grable, the president, and he put on that note, bring it up again. And I thought, oh, he's a lawyer, he's the president, I'm a lawyer, so I'll follow his orders. So I just, direction, so I stood up and I said, Mr. President, I move to add clean and healthful before the word environment. And he says, okay, fine. And so I turned to the floor and I start to talk, but they're not
They're
listening.
ready. They're not
listening.
paying
They're
any
all over.
attention, man.
There's
It's
no,
done with.
I thought CB would stand up again and say
yeah.
no, and they were reading newspapers, they were talking to each other, they were all going.
Well, and some of us that were even in support thought, God, we just got shellacked.
We did
You
the
know,
worst ever.
why is he doing
Mean
this
that.
again?
I'm
Because
doing
we
it.
didn't know about
No.
the note from
The
Graybill.
notes, I'd do it again. I didn't even know. So I'm trying to talk, think of new arguments after 5 hours, and then I finally turned to President Grable. I said, I can't talk to the floor. There's so much commotion going on. I can't talk to the delegates. And so he took that gavel and he rapped that thing 3 of the hardest times I've ever seen him rap. And then he said, delegates, Delegate Campbell has something to say and I want you to listen to him. And it all went silent. It was just frozen. And then they came to me. I didn't have a speech. So I'm looking at all of them and I'm saying, what do I do now? And so I said, well, we've lost all these other votes. So I said, look, you had in all these votes said you wanted a clean and healthful environment, but you didn't want to put the words in because they're saying it would cause more chaos, okay? I said, look, if you don't put those words in and you go home and you're seeking to ratify this Constitution, you're going to be walking down the street of your town that elected you to this convention, and some little kid's going to come up to me, or you, and say, what did you do about my environment in the future? And you're going to have to say, we decided to have one, okay? So the little kid is going to shake his head, and he's going to say, you spent $500,000 in writing a Constitution for me in the future to have an environment, but you're not going to tell me whether it's going to be a good environment or a bad environment. And he's going to shake his head and walk away. I said, there won't be any more North Dakota jokes. There'll be one big Montana joke that you put in a Constitution with an environment and you didn't say you wanted it clean and healthful for those kids out there. So if you want it, you got to vote for it right now. This is it. And I sat down. And nobody got up. And so Leo said, okay, we'll call for the vote. 30 changed their mind on that little North Dakota joke and clean and healthful. 30 changed over to me, and we won. We got the majority on that one, about 54, 48. So, yeah, so we got it there. And then Leo just said, okay, now we're going to move to the next section. And I thought, somebody's going to stand up and ask for reconsideration. This isn't going to just sit in there, is it? And so he said, okay, now let's go to the next section. Nobody stood up. Now, Don Scanlon came over and he patted me on the back and he said, Bob, that was really good. He's the only delegate that did that. And at his funeral in Red Lodge, I was looking up his record, but he came over after he said that it was good. I gave the eulogy in Red Lodge for him, and I noted that he voted against me on that last vote. So I thought, that's good. But anyway, that's the way it got in, and it stayed in, and nobody was able to get it out, and now it's been stronger. But it had to be in there before the inalienable rights was the last one that was put in, because it matched the one environment, and the preamble had words that the inalienable rights just made. And Bill Burkhart, the Presbyterian minister from Helena, was the one that put it up there. And he wasn't a lawyer, and he was asked, are you putting that in there so you can close down the smelter at Anaconda? And he said, no. He said, I'm a minister. I'm not going to sue you. I'm just thinking words, you know. He said, look, we got this big Charlie Russell painting up there. He loved that painting. He said, we've got it in natural resources. We've got it in the preamble. So this just fits the three of them together. And he sat down.
And it's interesting, I think, to note that it was, as I mentioned, it was 6 days later that he moved that the natural resources was adopted on May 1st, on May 7th, and the vote on his specific amendment to insert it in Section 3 was 79-7.
So by that time, I think the people were going with the flow, so to speak. And consistency.
Yes, and you know, and C.B. McNeil, and he certainly supported it at that point, because he did say, you know, my notion is to support the strongest provision, and so I think by that point he was convinced that it was much stronger.
But this was March 1st and 7, not May.
No, you said May.
Yeah, you said
I'm
May
sorry,
3
yes,
times.
March. Oh, yeah, no,
this was
yeah,
March.
All
Okay.
March, yes, excuse me, March.
But
yes.
you made the point earlier that having it in the inalienable rights section gave it better standing as far as the primacy of the law, so to speak.
Yes.
It had a stronger meaning.
Yes, it became a
right?
fundamental right, and in constitutional law, once something that has been established as a fundamental right, the state has a higher responsibility for providing for it and not infringing on it. And that became very important in this first environmental case that went before the Montana Supreme Court, the 7-Up Pete case. So the fact that it was a fundamental right to a clean and healthful environment requires a much higher standard. Because, I mean, just sort of as a general rule, and it'll sound familiar to you and everybody else, is once you've got a fundamental right, the state cannot abridge it without showing a compelling state interest. And any kind of a statute, and what was at issue in 7-Up Pete, it was a statute that excluded certain kinds of mining permits, I believe, right? Exemptions. It had made some exemptions for certain kinds of mining, and it didn't require any environmental review. And they argued that that violated the Constitution because they were just excluding from any kind of review this whole host of things that might very well degrade the environment. And so again, the U.S. or the Montana Supreme Court struck that law as being in violation of both the Constitution, the Article 3, Section 3 in the Bill of Rights, as well as in violation of Article 9.
This was not popular. The legislators did not like this. It took 27 years before the Supreme Court had to see if that was an actual constitutional right. So 23 23 years after we put it in the Constitution that 7 Pete decision came down, and Maine Ann used in her argument, you shouldn't have to wait till dead fish are floating on a river to find out if it's polluted. And Jerry Treeweiler, writing the decision as justice, put it in his decision. And he not only said that you don't have to wait for the fish to be dead, he said the preamble was enacted, and so it's part of the law too. He wrapped them all up, and this is what the Independent Record did the next day. It was finally decided that it was a constitutional right that's enforceable. That was 23 years later after the Constitution.
I find it very interesting that despite all the legal beagles who were in the con, many of whom, since they dealt with litigation all the time, thought that this would be nothing but fraught with lawsuits. And yet, it took 23 years to have a lawsuit actually adjudicated.
It was tough.
So it wasn't such a fearsome thing after all, or a fearful thing after all.
That was I found that was a scare tactic that a lot of the lawyers used for anything they didn't want to get in. Oh, you're inviting, opening Pandora's box. There's going to be lawsuits. This is a Social Security Retirement Act for lawyers, and
it is interesting to see that. And when you think about the people, some of the people who opposed these provisions, would it be fair to say that, or suggest that, being that they were elected to represent their areas, that they had areas where there were large economic interests and a lot of jobs? And they were legitimately worried about those, so they were reflecting that in their reticence to try to go in this direction. Would that be a fair?
Well, I think it's totally accurate, because Marshall Murray got up on the floor and said, I represent the area where there's 1,000 people employed up at the Columbia Falls aluminum plant, and I can't support this if I think it could very well put the aluminum plant out of business. So there were some absolutely practical people who were concerned about the fallout.
The interesting conflict that one would have to feel, being from Butte or Anaconda as an example, where clearly degradation had occurred over a century. Because of standards and neglect and all kinds of things, and how it was seen differently. And yet, in 1972, there were still 5,000 direct Anaconda Company employees in Butte and Anaconda. Now, 9 years later, there were 17. But if you're an elected official, you could see the push and the pull.
Absolutely.
I've got environmental problems, but I'm worried about the jobs.
And that continues to be a struggle.
Now, we had 6 of our delegates that signed the Constitution that went out and denounced it in their districts. So out of 56 counties, we had 44 that voted against it. It was the rural versus the urban. It was the Tennessee decision that says, that when at 300 people shouldn't have one senator, when Yellowstone County had one. The reapportionment. So we were getting the urban people in there, and it was 50.1% for and 49.9 against.
Well, go ahead.
Excuse me. But on the environmental article, because some of the strip mining, most of strip mining was going on in the eastern part of the state, the ag interests, the ranchers, were very concerned, and so they were very much in favor of the reclamation provision. And the other thing that's important to note, Bob, I think in this environment article, is where water was protected. And again, at that point, we started to see the importance to the ag interest, as well as everybody else, the preservation of water. And so it was starting to be a big consideration in terms of the environment and economic development and trying to protect water quality for agriculture.
But agriculture exempted itself out of all of the environmental acts they passed in the legislature.
Well, that was, of
They've
course, in
always
the
done that.
legislature, and
Well,
it
so
does
that's
speak
it.
to, I think it speaks to the interesting conflicts again.
Yes.
That those that were involved with around where strip mining was occurring had to be a bit fearful about the environmental provisions and the need for reclamation, and yet the Farm Bureau was the biggest leader against the
kill it.
the
Yes.
passage.
Right.
And it goes to show you that no segment of the economy is monolithic. There's a lot of diversity within all of them. Now, by the
Exactly.
way, we're getting closer to the end of the program, and I want to take a second and ask each of you to give me a little bit of a personal reflection about how you feel, not just about the meaning of the Constitution, but your opportunity to help craft this document. Can we start?
Oh, it's got to be the greatest experience of my life, and I think every delegate would tell you that. That day that we signed it, every one of us went up. They called our name, we went up. Jean Bowman was our secretary. We'd sit there and sign it, the picture would be taken, and the 100 did that, and that was the proudest moment of my life, and I think every delegate you had there, except for those 6. But it grew so much because we had to see it ratified. The Supreme Court said we couldn't spend the last $50,000 to educate people. They hauled up our president, Leo Grable, on a contempt charge in front of the court before ratification, and it looked we were dead. But some people said, well, if the Supreme Court doesn't like the proposed Constitution, maybe there's some good things in it. And so I think that helped it. And we as delegates had to go around, and do this. And I brought you one of George Harper's stickers that says, praise the Lord and pass the Constitution.
George was a minister from Helena.
We took it on ourselves.
Not only was God in the preamble now, but he was on the bumper sticker.
Yeah.
He's on the bumper sticker. He
the
did it, and he was great. And we had to do this ourselves because the Supreme Court held we could not spend that money.
Well, in fact, in those days there wasn't much. But as I recall, $10,000 of private money was raised to promote it, and that was it.
Well,
Maynann, would you give us your reflections on your personal participation, your sense of involvement in this thing, what it's meant to you?
Well, like Bob, it probably is certainly the best honor I've ever had, being able to serve and being able to participate. And more than anything, I think it just opened my eyes to what is possible, because I really, at that point, had only lived in Montana for 4 years. I moved here in 1967. And for me to make it through initially, there were 64 candidates, Bob, if you'll remember, that started for those 8 seats.
Right.
And then there was 24 in the general.
Right.
And for me to get, actually I got the second highest number of votes. John Toole was number 1. But for me at 24, just a graduate student, to be given that kind of honor, it's got to restore your faith in our democracy, in our, the willingness of people to accept people who are willing to come forth. So it opened so many doors to me, and it was a life-changing.
They recognized your ability,
I guess.
and you did it on
I
the
did.
campaign trail, at the convention, and ratification.
Well, I've got to tell you guys, as we wrap up here, that when we talk about these things, I don't know if they give you goosebumps, but they give me goosebumps.
It does.
It is, the Constitution of Montana is stunningly beautiful and good and complete and progressive, and it's the best in the nation. It's been cited as that. The preamble, the environmental articles are part of that thing. You're the heart and soul of those issues. It is a thrill for me to be able to be here with both of you. And thank you for participating in the Crucible of Change. We'll look forward to seeing you on the next program.
We'll be around.